I had just finished tightening the last stubborn screw on the heavy brass hinge, the metallic bite of the tool finally yielding to a smooth, satisfying finish. I straightened my tired back, gave the solid oak door a firm test pull, and watched as it swung shut with a whisper. Smooth, quiet, and perfectly weighted. The way a door is truly meant to move when someone has taken the time to do it right. I tapped the edge of the polished frame gently with my knuckle, a quiet gesture of satisfaction, then turned around to find Maya standing there, offering a slow, knowing smile. "I fix your plumbing," I began, letting a soft laugh escape my lips. "I fix your shelving units. Now I'm fixing your bedroom doors, too. You might as well just marry me, Maya, and save us both the endless trouble." I had tossed the words out into the air as a careless joke, my voice light with the easy amusement of a neighbor playing the fool. But Maya didn't laugh. She didn't even smile. She simply looked at me. One agonizing second, 2 endless seconds, stretching out into a heavy, suspended silence that felt far longer than any 2 seconds had ever had any right to feel. Then, without a single warning or a backward glance, she stepped forward, reached out, and took my calloused hand firmly in hers, leading me through the threshold into her bedroom without uttering a single word. I stood frozen right there in the middle of her quiet, softly lit room, my heavy leather tool belt still dangling awkwardly off my hip, utterly bewildered and completely stripped of any idea what was happening to my carefully ordered world. Since when had our lives drifted into this strange, unspoken territory? I honestly couldn't pinpoint the exact second or hour it had happened. Only that somewhere amidst all those quiet favors, shared coffee mugs, and lingering glances, the ground beneath us had quietly shifted. My name is Declan Hurst. I am 34 years old, and I spend my days bringing order back to broken houses. I work with roofs that leak during winter storms, warped floors that groan underfoot, stubborn plumbing that refuses to cooperate, and erratic wiring that demands steady hands and a cool head. It's a career built on patience, fixing things that look far worse once you peel back the surface than they ever did when you first started poking around. It certainly isn't the glamorous future I envisioned for myself 20 years ago, back when I was a younger, more foolish version of myself dreaming of corner offices, expensive suits, and crisp business cards with an important-sounding title printed neatly beneath my name, meant to impress total strangers at loud, superficial parties. Yet, looking back, I find a strange, grounded peace in what I do now. I set my own hours, answer to no one, and never have to endure a shrill phone call at 8 in the morning, demanding to know why a project isn't moving faster. I have grown to cherish that hard-earned silence far more than I ever anticipated. Some mornings, I find myself standing alone in a stranger's kitchen with a heavy wrench resting in my palm, suddenly hit with the realization that this honest, physical labor is the one thing in my life I am genuinely proud of, far more than any hollow corporate title I once chased when I still cared about what the world thought of me. The truth is, I got a divorce from Fiona a year before any of this quiet chapter began. We never had children together, a fact that always seemed to shock people when they found out, as if 8 long years of marriage ought to have yielded a heavier harvest. 8 years. If I had to distill that entire marriage down into a single, aching sentence, I would say we married simply because the timing happened to be convenient, not because our souls were truly aligned. Fiona was a force of nature, loud in a way that effortlessly consumed every corner of a room the moment she crossed the threshold. She possessed an unyielding ambition that never allowed itself to slow down, and she perpetually desired me to be a slightly remodeled version of myself, someone with sharper instincts for the things she deemed important. I want to be entirely fair to her memory. She wasn't a cruel person. Even now, looking back across the wreckage of our past, I recognize that we were simply pointing our compasses in entirely different directions. No matter how many years we spent pretending that time would eventually make our needles agree, exhaustion inevitably devoured what little affection we had left. It happens the way it always does when 2 people grow too tired to speak the brutal, necessary truths out loud. We signed the final papers on a remarkably ordinary gray morning in November. It didn't feel like it should have mattered as much as it ultimately did. I vividly remember driving home afterward, feeling less like something precious had died and more like a long overdue word had finally been spoken out loud after years of both of us gracefully dancing around the obvious elephant in the room. In the wake of the divorce, I rented an older house tucked away on Hawthorne Street. One of those classic Portland homes with weathered wooden floors that complained with a familiar groan on the exact same stair-step every single morning, almost as if the house itself were sleepily greeting me on my way down to the kitchen. It wasn't much to look at from the outside, but it featured a cozy backyard bordered by a rustic fence line that caught the soft, drifting morning fog. The pale morning light hit the kitchen window at precisely 7:30 every day, as though the structure possessed its own internal clock, and the rent was modest enough that I didn't have to hesitate before signing the lease. I took it upon myself to fix whatever broke in that house without ever bothering to call the landlord. Partly because it was infinitely faster than waiting for a property manager to send someone out, but mostly, if I am being brutally honest with myself, because physical labor gave my hands something concrete to do, keeping my racing thoughts from wandering back into dark, lonely corners. That distraction mattered deeply to me that year, far more than I would have ever dared to admit to anyone who cared to ask. I lived entirely alone. I brewed my own dark coffee in the mornings, lost myself in books or televised games in the evenings, and picked up odd repair jobs over the weekends when the work flowed in steadily. I wasn't lonely, or at least, I had successfully convinced myself of that comforting lie for long enough to believe it on most days, which felt close enough to the actual truth that I never dared to poke holes in the illusion. 3 weeks after I unpacked my final box, I discovered that the back gate of my yard opened into a shared alleyway connected to the property right next door. An old, neighborly arrangement that must have survived decades before either house had changed hands. Curious and wanting to be neighborly, I had a spare brass key cut, figuring whoever lived on the other side might find it useful sooner or later, and walked it over one crisp Saturday afternoon. The woman who answered my knock was Maya Corin. She had rich brown hair loosely pulled back from her face, wore an oversized knit sweater with the sleeves pushed up past her elbows, and carried an expression of quiet surprise, as if she had certainly not expected a stranger to be standing on her porch offering a key like some kind of peace offering. I stumbled through my explanation, rushing my words the way people always do when they suddenly become hyper-aware of how awkward they might look. Maya simply smiled, accepted the key from my open palm, and walked over to her kitchen drawer. She pulled out a tiny length of vibrant teal ribbon and tied it securely onto the brass ring right there in front of me, never even pausing to ask if I minded. "So you'll always recognize it as yours," she said softly, "just in case I ever have to give it back." I let out a light laugh and walked away, giving the moment very little thought. It felt like one of those small, thoughtful gestures that neighbors exchange and completely forget about within a week. The kind of trivial memory you'd never dwell on unless someone later pointed backward and asked you to recall its precise origin. I went straight home and hung that modest brass key with its teal ribbon on the small iron hook right next to my kitchen board, exactly where my eyes would catch it every single time I walked past. I don't honestly know why I never bothered tossing it into a cluttered drawer alongside my spare house keys and mailbox tags. I kept telling myself I would get around to cleaning off that hook eventually. I never did. For the first few weeks, my only glimpses of her came through the hazy kitchen window while I waited for my morning coffee to brew. I would watch her watering her potted plants out on the balcony in the early morning chill, her hair piled up casually, a warm ceramic mug clutched in one hand while she worked. She was a wonderfully quiet neighbor, never loud, never intrusive, and entirely free of that grating presence that makes you feel crowded or watched. She was, quite literally, the exact kind of person I needed living next to me after an entire year of feeling like every room I stood in held a quiet, critical opinion about who I ought to be. I told myself I didn't think twice about her, or rather, I convinced myself I didn't, which is an entirely different thing altogether, though I lacked the emotional clarity to understand that distinction back then. At the time, I would have sworn I barely noticed her existence beyond the baseline courtesy of knowing my neighbor's name. The heavy scent of aged wood and fresh paint defined those initial weeks inside my rental house before those sharp aromas finally faded into the comfortable background of daily life. The staircase continued its familiar routine, groaning on the exact same wooden step every morning with a single, unchanging pitch. The Portland sun slid across my kitchen counter like clockwork at 7:30, advancing half an inch further every week as the seasons slowly turned. And that small teal ribbon fluttered softly on the key ring by the counter, ordinary, entirely unremarkable, and easy to overlook, yet persistently present. During the second month, the excuses began, though I certainly wouldn't have labeled them as such back then. Maya knocked on my door one morning to ask if she could borrow a power drill to hang a few heavy pictures. I handed it over, and naturally, I ended up walking next door to help her mount the heavy shelving unit securely into the studs. It took 15 minutes of straightforward work, nothing that should have lingered in my memory. Yet, she brewed a fresh pot of coffee afterward to express her gratitude, and it tasted remarkably rich, far better than the bitter brew I usually forced down my throat every morning. A week later, she needed packaging tape. The week after that, she couldn't figure out how to shut off the secondary water valve beneath her sink. A technical mystery to most people outside my line of work. Every single time, there was a logical reason. Every excuse made complete sense on its own merits, and each favor was small enough that I never once questioned why they kept recurring with such reliable frequency. I remained entirely blind to the delicate pattern silently weaving itself beneath the surface. I only knew that I genuinely didn't mind when she knocked on my door, a quiet contentment that should have tipped me off long before I had any conscious reason to search for hidden meanings. By the second month, the repairs shifted indoors. One evening around 7, she texted me to say a kitchen pipe had ruptured beneath her sink, pooling water across the linoleum floor. I grabbed my toolbox, hurried over, and spent a solid hour stretched out on her cool kitchen tiles, wrestling with rusted joints, while she moved quietly in the background. She sat comfortably up on the counter, nibbling on a cold sandwich and losing herself in a paperback novel while the waterproof sealant dried. She didn't hover anxiously over my shoulder, nor did she pepper me with nervous questions the way jittery homeowners often do when a stranger is elbow deep in their plumbing. She simply sat there in peaceful quiet, as if my presence stretched out on her kitchen floor on a random weeknight was the most natural thing in the world. I found myself deeply appreciating that unspoken trust, though I failed to pause and ask myself why her effortless faith in me mattered so profoundly, why it felt so entirely different from the dozens of other repair jobs I had completed for clients who barely looked up from their glowing phones the entire time I worked. When I finally packed up my tools and left that night, she stood framed in her doorway, watching silently until I safely crossed the threshold into my own home, the amber porch light catching the edge of her rolled-up sleeve. I didn't consciously register the gesture then. I only recognized its weight much later, looking back across the stretch of months with the heavy clarity of someone who finally knows how the story ends. By the third month, the morning coffee had evolved into an unspoken ritual. Neither of us had ever proposed it as a deliberate plan. One crisp morning, I stepped out into the backyard with my ceramic mug, only to find her already standing on the opposite side of the wooden fence, holding her own steaming cup against the chilly air. "You're up early," I called out softly. "So are you," she replied. That was it. That entire exchange constituted our morning greeting. We stood there side by side for a quarter of an hour, quietly watching the pale light wash over the dew-drenched grass, before silently turning back toward our respective houses to begin our days. The very next morning, she was out there waiting again. And the morning after that. The routine knitted itself into our lives far faster than I ever expected ordinary habits to form. There were no rigid schedules, no spoken invitations, just a shared understanding that bypassed the need for direct conversation. Some mornings brought a steady Portland drizzle, yet we stood there anyway under the dripping eaves of the roof, neither of us willing to be the first to suggest skipping our quiet vigil. Once, I overslept and missed my alarm by 10 agonizing minutes, scrambling out the back door in a rush. To my quiet astonishment, she was still standing there by the fence line, and a second, steaming mug of coffee was already resting on the flat top of the wooden rail, waiting for me as if it had been sitting there all along. I muttered a quick apology for keeping her waiting. She simply smiled, brushing it off as if it were of no consequence. I never stopped to ask how she miraculously knew the exact strength of my coffee, the precise amount of sugar I preferred on mornings when I wanted a little sweetness, or the exact minute I usually emerged from my door. I never thought to ask. Not once. By the fourth month, her washing machine decided to betray her, the drain pump giving out entirely and leaving a heavy load of laundry sitting in a stagnant pool of sudsy water. She texted me that afternoon, offering a polite apology for the inconvenient timing before I even had a chance to confirm I was coming. I walked over after finishing my dinner, knelt on the damp laundry room floor, and unbolted the front panel of the machine to diagnose the mechanical failure. Maya stood quietly in the doorway, her arms crossed neatly over her chest, watching me work with that familiar, patient stillness, the exact same posture she had held the night I fixed her kitchen sink. It was an echo of a stance I hadn't consciously registered during our earlier encounters. As I tightened a stubborn hose clamp without glancing up, the words slipped out of my mouth before my conscious mind had time to catch them. "I fix your pipes," I muttered into the hollow interior of the machine. "I fix your shelves. Now I'm fixing your washing machine, too. You might as well just marry me, Maya, and save us both the trouble." I chuckled softly at my own tired joke, my hands already moving on to the next phase of the repair. Maya fell entirely silent. A heavy, absolute stillness that lasted just long enough for me to notice it, had my mind not been entirely occupied by the humming machinery around us. Then, in a voice that sounded unnaturally, meticulously even, she asked, "Do you charge extra for washing machine repairs?" I laughed harder at her comeback, genuinely appreciating what I thought was a sharp, witty rebuttal. As far as I was concerned, the exchange was over. Just a light-hearted bit of banter traded between two neighbors who enjoyed an easy rapport. It was the kind of throwaway comment I would have completely forgotten by the time I walked back to my own kitchen, had it not looped back around to claim my heart much later. I never looked up from my work. If I had paused to raise my eyes, I would have seen that she wasn't smiling at all, that whatever complex emotion had briefly flickered across her features had nothing whatsoever to do with repair fees. A few weeks after the laundry room incident, she asked if I wanted to accompany her to the weekend farmers market. It was the very first time we ventured anywhere together that wasn't tethered to a broken appliance or a household malfunction. We strolled leisurely between the colorful wooden stalls under a crisp October sun, purchasing crisp Honey-Crisp apples from an elderly vendor who greeted Maya warmly by name, a block of sharp local cheddar, and a bundle of fresh thyme that both of us silently knew would eventually wither and brown in the forgotten depths of my refrigerator. When we reached the checkout counter, I paid for both of our purchases without hesitation, sparking a mild, playful protest from her all the way to the edge of the next stall. I refused to back down. As we walked back home along the leafy sidewalk, she stared straight ahead at the pavement instead of looking at me and murmured, "You know, Declan, you're annoying in a way that makes it infuriatingly difficult to actually stay annoyed at you." I didn't fully grasp the deeper weight hidden beneath her words. I didn't ask her to unpack them. I simply laughed, safely categorizing it in my mind as one of those quirky, affectionate things people say that requires no heavy analysis. Perhaps it was meant as a light compliment, or perhaps it drifted far closer to the aching truth than either of us was brave enough to articulate plainly at the time. We walked the remainder of the way home wrapped in a comfortable silence that felt entirely devoid of awkwardness, a quiet cadence that had long since become its own form of intimacy. 2 weeks before that fateful night that permanently altered the trajectory of our lives, she texted me late in the afternoon. "Bedroom door is stuck on the hinge again. Won't latch shut properly. Are you free?" It was a brief, unremarkable message, entirely devoid of urgency. It was the kind of casual text I had answered a dozen times before without a second thought. I arrived just as the autumn twilight was settling over the neighborhood, the street lamps along Hawthorne Street flickering to life one by one in the gathering dusk. The bottom hinge of her bedroom door had slipped out of true alignment, causing the wood to bind stubbornly against the frame every time she tried to push it shut, preventing the metal latch from catching its groove. Upon closer inspection, I noticed the top hinge was also beginning to loosen, the screw holes worn out from decades of wear and tear that predated our time in these houses. Deciding to do the job right, I pulled out my screwdriver and tightened both hinges. Maya stood quietly inside the bedroom, leaning her back against the pale wall with her arms crossed over her chest in that exact, familiar posture she had assumed the night I fixed her washing machine. It was a mirror image of an unconscious habit I was only now beginning to recognize. I realized with a start that she always stood like that whenever she watched me work, always maintaining the same patient, statuesque stillness. I never asked her why. Looking back across the timeline of our friendship, I suspect a dormant part of my mind had already begun cataloging every small, consistent detail about her without my active consent. Much like the way a cautious buyer notices the subtle quirks of a house they are secretly falling in love with, long before they admit to themselves that a decision has already been made. The rich aroma of morning coffee seemed to cling to the fabric of those passing months within my memory. I could still vividly hear the Portland songbirds working through their daily routines in the overgrown yards, watching the maple leaves slowly flare into brilliant crimsons along the fence line one branch at a time. And that very same brass key with its faded teal ribbon still hung faithfully on my kitchen board, resting in the exact same spot where I had placed it 4 months earlier. Not once, not even for a single fleeting afternoon, had I tossed it away into a forgotten drawer. I gave the final screw on the bottom hinge one last firm turn, pushed myself up off the floor, and tested the door. It swung shut with a seamless, quiet glide. I tapped the wooden molding lightly with my knuckle, turned around, and flashed Maya an easy grin. "I fix your pipes?" I said, the familiar cadence rolling off my tongue. "I fix your shelves. Now I'm fixing your bedroom door, too. You might as well just marry me, Maya, and save us both the trouble." The words spilled out effortlessly, a direct echo of the joke I had cracked on the night of the washing machine repair, meant to carry the exact same weight. Nothing more than harmless banter designed to fill the sudden quiet after a job well done. Maya didn't laugh. She didn't offer a witty comeback. She simply stared at me. 1 second. 2 agonizing seconds. That exact, pregnant pause I had so foolishly misinterpreted months before. Then, without a word, she stepped forward and closed the small distance between us, her warm hand wrapping firmly around mine. Gently, deliberately, she led me away from the hallway and straight into the bedroom, walking right through the very doorway I had finished repairing barely 5 minutes prior. She stopped in the center of the room, where the soft amber glow of the bedside lamp cast long, gentle shadows across the walls. A faint, sweet scent of a vanilla candle lingered somewhere just out of sight, underscored by the low, steady hum of the air conditioner. She turned to face me, her eyes locked onto mine, wrapped in an absolute, breathless silence. I stood awkwardly in the middle of her private sanctuary, my heavy tool belt still weighing down my hip, completely at a loss for words. "Maya, what are you doing?" She didn't answer right away, letting the silence stretch far beyond our usual comfortable boundaries, growing heavy enough to press against our chests. Then, softly, she spoke. "Marry me. Save us both the trouble." I was just seeing if you actually meant it when you said it the first time. "I was only joking," I murmured, my voice suddenly feeling small. "I know," she whispered, her gaze dropping briefly to the floor between us. "I wasn't." We sat down together side by side on the edge of the bed after that, talking in hushed tones until the clock crept past midnight. We didn't discuss anything dramatic or grand, nothing that would sound particularly monumental if repeated to a stranger the next day. It was simply a conversation built on a new, terrifying level of honesty, stripping away the polite fences that had separated us since the day we met, leaving no distance to shield us from speaking the bare, unvarnished truth. I finally walked home around midnight. Nothing wildly dramatic had physically occurred in that room. No grand declarations beyond those few quiet sentences. Yet the entire universe had shifted on its axis in a way my vocabulary wasn't yet equipped to handle. The morning routine persisted, relentless and comforting in its familiarity. The coffee was still brewed and carried out to the yard, 2 steaming mugs crossing through the same back doors. She still walked out to her side of the fence line at dawn. But now, an entirely new energy pulsed through the quiet space between us. Not a heavy burden, but an undeniable, radiant presence that refused to be ignored, acknowledged by both of us even if our lips remained silent on the matter. I didn't reach for my phone to call anyone to hash it out. Not a lifelong friend, not my estranged brother, no one. That simply wasn't my way. I went to work, returned home in the evening, stared up at that brass key resting on my kitchen board, and for the first time in 4 solid months, felt no passing urge to sweep it away into a hidden drawer. 10 days after that transformative night, Fiona shattered my fragile peace by showing up unannounced on my front porch. I recognized the cadence of her voice through the solid wood door before my hand even reached the knob. An instinctive muscle memory forged over 8 years of marriage that hadn't entirely faded from my nervous system. 8 long months without a single whisper from her. And now this. Fiona pushed her way into the hallway without waiting for an invitation, moving with the entitled familiarity of someone who believed basic social courtesies simply didn't apply to her, acting as though the 8-month chasm of silence between us had left zero impact on her commanding stride. She swept her critical gaze across my living room, wearing that painfully familiar expression of a hunter searching for easy prey, looking for any subtle piece of evidence she could brandish as definitive proof that I was failing miserably at managing my life without her guiding hand. She dropped unceremoniously into the armchair by the window, treating it as if it still rightfully belonged to her domain. "You still haven't bought a new sofa," she noted coolly. I remained standing near the entryway, refusing to give her the satisfaction of claiming the psychological high ground by sitting down opposite her. "Fiona, what are you doing here?" She fixed her sharp eyes directly on me, wearing the look she always donned whenever she had mentally scripted how a confrontation was going to end. "Your neighbor, Maya. Did you happen to know that she actually knows who I am?" A heavy silence swallowed the room. "We went to the exact same high school," Fiona continued, pacing her words deliberately for maximum impact. "Lincoln High. And yet, she apparently never thought to mention that little fact to you, did she?" She paused right where she wanted the knife to twist. "She has carried feelings for you, Declan, from well before you and I finally split up. I know this for a fact because a mutual acquaintance let it slip to me." My mind raced, not out of blind anger, but in a frantic attempt to separate whatever grains of truth might exist from the elaborate narrative Fiona was undoubtedly constructing. It was an old defensive maneuver of hers. Whenever a conversation slipped outside her iron grip, she instinctively manufactured new angles to drag control back into her hands. "Why are you telling me this, Fiona?" I asked slowly, weighing every syllable with exhausting caution. "Because I think you deserve to know the true character of the person standing right next to you," she replied smoothly. "No," I countered, my voice dropping an octave as I saw straight through the facade. "You're telling me this because you simply cannot bear the thought of anyone standing next to me at all." Fiona stood up abruptly. She wasn't angry. A chilling detachment that was infinitely worse than any explosive rage she could have mustered. Far worse than any version of this confrontation I had mentally prepared myself to handle. She simply looked at me with the absolute, unshakable arrogance of a woman convinced of her own infallible righteousness. "Believe it or choose not to. That's entirely on you," she said dismissively. She turned and walked out, the front door clicking shut with a precise, measured thud. Not slammed in a fit of temper, but closed with a chilling finality. I stood in the center of the quiet living room, the space feeling suddenly hollow and unnaturally still in her wake. My eyes drifted upward to that brass key with its teal ribbon hanging on the kitchen board. For the very first time since I hung it there, I truly looked at it. Not a casual glance that registers nothing. Not a visual habit my eyes glossed over day after day. I stared at it and demanded complete honesty from myself. Why had I stubbornly displayed this trivial object in the most prominent spot in my house for 8 consecutive months without a single moment of second guessing? I wasn't furious with Maya, not cleanly, at least not in any straightforward way I could neatly label. But I knew with absolute certainty that I needed to hear the unvarnished truth straight from her lips. Not filtered through Fiona's malicious spin. Not handed down secondhand through the toxic grapevine of old acquaintances. Fiona's sharp voice still echoed faintly in the hollow corridors of my mind, carrying the exact same timbre it had possessed 8 years ago, completely untouched by the passage of time. Her expensive perfume, a sharp, high-end floral scent she had worn since before we even met, lingered ghost-like in the air, standing there in the quiet aftermath of her departure. A sudden, jarring realization hit me. I couldn't for the life of me recall what Maya's perfume smelled like. All I knew was that she always carried the warm, grounding scent of dark roast coffee and a faint, sweet whisper of vanilla. Nothing overly precise, but entirely beautifully hers. The memory of Fiona's door closing finally faded from the empty rooms. The following morning, I knocked on Maya's door long before my usual operating hours. When she opened it and caught sight of the grim, resolute expression etched across my face, understanding flashed in her eyes before a single syllable crossed my lips. She stepped aside silently, granting me entry without demanding an explanation for my unannounced dawn visit. I stood in the center of her living room, refusing the offer to sit. Fiona came by my house yesterday. Maya didn't feign ignorance or blink in confusion. She cast her gaze down toward the floorboards and drew in a slow, steady breath. I figured she would eventually show up at your doorstep. I didn't know when. You knew her? Yes, Maya answered softly, lifting her eyes to meet mine. Lincoln High. We weren't close friends by any stretch of the imagination. We simply occupied the same graduating class, passing each other in crowded hallways without ever holding a real conversation. She offered a tired, honest smile. I never brought it up because there was never any natural reason to do so, Declan. You're my neighbor. We talk about the weather, broken plumbing, and morning coffee. People don't sit around reciting their high school rosters to each other. Fiona claimed you had feelings for me long before our marriage fell apart, I said, watching her face for any flicker of deceit. Maya's silence stretched on for a moment, heavier and more profound than before. When she finally spoke, her voice was remarkably steady. Not the brittle steadiness of someone desperately masking a lie, but the profound calm of a person who had carried a buried truth for a long time, simply waiting for the world to catch up. That isn't true, she stated plainly. I knew who you were only because Fiona had mentioned your name a handful of times back then. Nothing substantial, just passing references. But I didn't truly know your face. I didn't know a single authentic thing about who you were until the day you walked up to my porch holding out that key 8 months ago. She stepped closer. I only started truly paying attention to you around the 3rd month after you moved in, after I had witnessed firsthand the kind of man you actually are when you think nobody is watching. Paying attention. I repeated the phrase inside my head, rolling the words over, testing how they stacked up against everything I thought I understood about our slow-burning history. It's the most honest word I have for it, she added quietly. I stood motionless, letting the weight of her confession settle into the quiet room, refusing to rush past the vulnerability in her voice because I knew she had chosen those words with deliberate care. Without breaking eye contact, Maya turned and walked briskly into the kitchen. She returned a moment later holding a small object. The brass key, adorned with its bright teal ribbon, the very spare I had hastily forged for her 8 months ago without a second thought. I meant to return this to you so many times, she confessed, her fingers gently stroking the metal. Almost every single time I manufactured a small excuse to knock on your door, whether I was borrowing a tool or asking for advice. I would walk back home afterward and tell myself, tomorrow is the day I finally give that key back. But whenever the moment actually arrived, I simply didn't want to let it go. She stepped forward and pressed the cold brass into my open palm, closing my fingers over it with a feather-light touch. I'm not holding on to it as an excuse anymore. Do whatever you want with it now, Declan. The choice is entirely yours. I lowered my gaze to examine the small piece of metal resting heavily in my hand. It felt substantially heavier than it had on the day I first handed it to her. The raw brass had darkened gracefully over 8 months of hanging in a corner of my kitchen where direct sunlight never quite reached, and that vibrant teal ribbon remained tied in a tight, secure knot precisely as she had fashioned it on our very first afternoon. Not a single frayed edge, despite all the hidden emotional weather it had weathered in the interim. I walked back home, carried the key straight to my kitchen table, and set it down in the center of the wood grain, sitting across from it as if it demanded my absolute, undivided focus. I spent hours untangling my thoughts, thinking long and hard about Fiona. Not out of a toxic desire to resurrect the past, not by a long shot, but because I needed absolute clarity. I needed to be certain that the momentous decision hovering on the horizon wasn't born out of a petty urge to prove a point to anyone, least of all my ex-wife. It couldn't be a reactionary knee-jerk response to Fiona's uninvited interference. It couldn't be disguised loneliness wearing a mask of convenience, nor could it be the lazy, frictionless path of two lonely souls simply sharing a property line. I sat in unbroken solitude for 2 solid hours, longer than I had remained entirely still to think about anything in years. I watched the afternoon light bleed across the kitchen counter, shifting from golden warmth into the flat, melancholic gray that always precedes the fall of night, until the answer crystallized inside my mind, belonging entirely to me and no one else. For 8 straight months, I had deliberately kept that key dangling in the most visible spot in my home. For 8 months, I had dodged the obvious question, letting it sit unexamined in the back of my mind. Now, finally, the fog had cleared, and I knew my own heart. 6 days after that clearing of the air, I walked up to Maya's door entirely on my own accord. Not because a pipe had burst, not because a household appliance had broken down, not because of any manufactured emergency, but simply because I finally possessed the courage to honor the only reason that truly mattered. I picked up the brass key from the kitchen table, slipped it into my pocket, and walked over. Maya opened the door, her eyes dropping instantly to my hand before rising to meet my face. "I want to keep this," I said quietly, letting the words hang in the crisp air. "If that's all right with you, of course." She didn't rush to answer, letting the quiet moment stretch just a fraction longer than necessary, a faint, knowing smile playing at the corners of her lips. Then, she stepped aside, not to welcome me in to fix a broken shelf or troubleshoot a faulty appliance, but to invite me across her threshold simply because I longed to be there, and because she wanted me there just as badly. As I stepped inside, I felt the comforting weight of the key resting securely in my palm, heavier and more real than it had felt that first day. Through the kitchen window, the slanted golden rays of late afternoon sunlight spilled across the room, carrying the distant, muffled hum of traffic from Hawthorne Street, ordinary, beautiful, and safely far away. The teal ribbon remained tied in its unbreakable knot. Not once in 8 long months had either of us untied it. Our mornings together continued unbroken, yet the underlying current had fundamentally transformed our world without altering its outward surface. The coffee mugs still made their daily journey out to the backyard, carried through those same familiar back doors. But I no longer stood a cautious, polite step back from the wooden fence line. I stood shoulder to shoulder with her, elbow grazing elbow in the crisp morning air. Neither of us bothered to pretend anymore that this was merely what polite neighbors did out of idle habit, or that any casual observer walking down the street would mistake us for 2 strangers who simply happened to share a property line. Eventually, I asked her out on a proper dinner date. Not an impromptu meal cobbled together after fixing a leaky sink, not a quick pit stop on the way back from a hardware store. Just dinner, an evening deliberately carved out of the calendar dedicated solely to the 2 of us. We drove to a small, intimate bistro tucked away in the Alberta Arts District, featuring rustic wooden tables and warm, low-hanging amber lights casting a cozy glow over every booth. Maya wore a deep red sweater that night, the color catching the ambient light just right. Midway through the meal, I slid my hand across the table and covered hers, and to my quiet joy, she didn't pull away. We lingered so long that the restaurant staff eventually began quietly stacking chairs around neighboring tables, only waking us from our trance when a polite waiter apologized for rushing us toward closing time. There was a learning curve, of course. Once, when a particularly grueling job ran disastrously late, I completely forgot to send her a quick text to let her know I was running behind. She didn't throw a fit or cause a scene when I finally showed up at her door, but her quiet disappointment was palpable. "One text, Declan," she said softly, looking straight into my eyes with unwavering calm. "That's all I'm ever asking for." I absorbed that lesson instantly, filing it away in the deepest recesses of my mind like something precious I never wanted to risk forgetting again. I had never possessed a natural talent for translating complex internal emotions into smooth, articulate sentences. I lacked the effortless vocabulary some people seemed born with. But Maya never pressured me to morph into someone I wasn't. Instead, she possessed a rare, intuitive gift. She knew precisely how to ask the right, piercing question at the exact right moment, and then possessed the staggering patience to wait quietly for my answer to surface, however long it took to crawl out of the dark. I learned how to slow down and speak my truth. Slowly, clumsily at first, but I truly learned it, conversation by conversation, brick by emotional brick. Once, we had a minor disagreement over something trivial. I can't even remember the exact spark that caused it anymore. All I recall is that she quietly walked out to the backyard afterward, standing alone in the cool evening air with her arms wrapped tightly around herself. I didn't hesitate. I stepped out through the back door and walked over, choosing not to bombard her with desperate attempts to fix whatever had gone wrong between us. I simply stood silently by her side in the dark. Later that night, she turned to me and whispered, "Thank you for not frantically chasing after me right away." It was a lesson I internalized faster than anything else I had ever encountered in my life up to that point, sparking a sudden, sharp reflection on how catastrophically differently that exact same moment would have played out with anyone else I had ever dated in my past. 3 months into this new chapter, our casual conversations naturally drifted toward a heavier, more permanent horizon. The prospect of renting a place together. A home that belonged equally to both of us, rather than two isolated houses tethered precariously together by a shared alley gate. It wasn't just a logical step forward. It was a quiet promise written in brass and teal ribbon, signaling the end of our separate wanderings and the beginning of a life finally built to last.